Hello, everyone. I am Anirban from CFA. I am joined by Christian Hallum. He works in the Oxfam as the tax lead. Oxfam, as you know, is brings out the inequality reports apart from other things, and the inequality reports have over the years served as extremely important tools in talking about in amplifying the concerns regarding inequality at the global stage as well as in India. Christian, there's been a really momentous developments happening at the global stage when it comes to tax reforms, demands for tax justice. Uh, at one level of to bring the the tech giants under reign, and also to democratize the entire idea of taxation. These are really crucial historical developments, but sadly, in this part of the world, in India, there is not much awareness about these issues, these concerns that are being going on at the global stage. Somehow, the discourse over here still tries not to touch upon the question of inequality, and that's been a touchy subject. And though of late it has been something that has been changing, particularly since the pandemic, it's way too on the face to kind of not address. So, not so much in terms of what we understand in terms of what is happening in the intra-country level, but we wish to know what are the developments that are happening at the UN stage, at the OECD stage, and how do you look at it?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks first of all for inviting me to speak on with you on this important topic. As you say, these are really momentous times, and I think it's really important to recognize the significance of what is happening in international tax these years, because it's no small feat. For decades, we have had a situation where a small handful of countries under the OECD have dictated the rules for international taxation. So, for example, if you have a big tech company operating in your country, these OECD rules dictate how you can and cannot tax these companies. They also dictate all sorts of other aspects of international taxation. And this system that we've had for many decades have really been a driver in the explosion in inequality that we at Oxfam and others have been trying to shed light on. And it's really in two ways. It's inequality between countries. So we've had mainly global south countries being excluded and marginalized in international taxation. There's been a system that have kept them out of the sort of ability to develop. But it's also within countries that this tax system have benefited a few rich people, the owners of corporations, those with massive wealth, while we've seen a shift of taxation towards those that cannot move their income or profits abroad, ordinary workers. And we've seen a shift towards value-added taxes, towards taxes that tend to fall on ordinary consumers, whereas taxes on corporations, on wealth, on high incomes have been dropping. So that's really the background. And what we're seeing now is a UN process. For the first time in many decades, we have a breakthrough at the UN where developing countries have come together to demand a UN tax convention. And this would be a legally binding instrument to negotiate with all countries present new rules for how international taxation should work. And this has great significance and promise to reduce inequality both between the global north and global south, but also within countries. And we're hugely excited about this.
Right. Christian, could you also, for our audience, elaborate as to why is the UN taxation a better platform, the UN Convention a better platform to discuss taxation, and why is it that the Global South considers this better than the deal that they were given in the OECD?
Yeah, so I think the background is really that the OECD, like I said, represent OECD countries first and foremost, and OECD is a rich country club. It was developed and organized around the interest and membership of rich countries. The OECD came under a lot of criticism for being the main forum to discuss international taxation, and this is why at some point during the last years, they started to expand the membership of which countries could participate in these negotiations. And they invited a lot of new countries to be part of the discussions. And that culminated in 2021 when they reached an agreement for what they called a two-pillar framework for international taxation. And this was to tax tax giant, and it was also to set a minimum tax. But throughout those negotiations, global South countries were complaining with right that they were being excluded. Their interests were not being heard, and that's why really the demand for UN tax convention came about. Everyone could see that even though the OECD was trying to make space for other countries, they were not really listening to them. And that's the final straw that broke the back of the camel, so to say, and really emboldened global South countries to push for a UN tax convention. So that's the background, and the benefits of a UN tax convention, according to the countries that are pushing for it, is that it delivers genuine representation for all countries. It is not hosted by rich countries. It is a process that will be owned by all countries, and it will give equal representation to different interests. It is also a much more transparent forum. What we saw in the OECD was that negotiations were completely closed off from media and public and civil society, and there was no minutes, no decision-making votes or anything that was made public, and that made it very, very difficult for anyone to follow what was actually happening and influence it. And a lot of corporate interest were able to thrive in that kind of closed environment. And the UN processes, for all its faults and shortcomings, is much more transparent, democratic, and open than the OECD. And that's why we're really hopeful that if we get a really ambitious UN tax convention, we will solve two of the big problems that we've had under the OECD, which is representation of global South countries, equal representation, and transparency and democracy in the way that negotiations are conducted. So those are the two big solutions that a UN process offers compared to the OECD.
So, Christian, thank you for clarifying that. We also have been seeing that after a lot of painstaking process of negotiations and all of that, uh, of course, we know that the even the US's commitment to even the OECD process had been dubious. But particularly in the recent geopolitical shifts with Trump in the US, what are its implications and both on the OECD as well as the UN tax convention? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities also, if at all, that are opening up?
Well, one of the arguments that we kept hearing about keeping international tax discussions within the OECD was to ensure that countries such as the US would buy into the process and be part of it. And what we've seen in recent time, and not just with the current administration, is that the US and particularly also the Congress, not just at presidential level, have signaled their unwillingness to follow this OECD agreement that they endorsed in 2021. Since 2021, Congress has not been able to pass the relevant legislation to implement this deal. And that has really demonstrated that the OECD is indeed not a guarantee to ensure that the US is kept on board. That is part of why the UN process is actually looking very promising. The US have already stated in a meeting in February this year that they will disengage from the UN Tax Convention. Now, that's not a hugely surprising thing, given that they have already signaled their unwillingness to be part of the OECD agreement that they themselves endorsed. The US has disengaged from the UN process, but they have also disengaged to some extent from the OECD process, so it's not a big difference. The big difference is that the UN process collects all the other countries of the world and allows for a truly genuine multilateralism that we never had through the OECD. And that our hope really is that countries will be emboldened to strengthen that sort of multilateralism now that it has become increasingly obvious that the US is not interested in that kind of work, is also using tariffs and other things to use a tax system as a kind of a political pressure tool. We believe that really demonstrates the need for a truly multilateral approach to international taxation to avoid those kind of conflicts. If anything, recent developments with the US have shown why we need a UN tax convention.
So right, so from that explanation, it does feel like that probably it's in a certain sense a blessing in disguise, because now the facade is completely out of the picture, and it's for the rest of the world to figure out as to whether it wants to unite and have a completely multilateral solution. Yeah, thanks, Christian. Just one last thing is one of the issues, like, of course, we know that even the minimum corporate tax, after so much of negotiation, was really watered down from 25 to 15. But primarily the other pillar, which has been really contentious and things have been really at a snail's pace, particularly when it comes to the digitized economy and putting taxes on the big tech, which kind of operates in a space across jurisdictions. So that has been really a bone of contention. The OECD, not much had been achieved. Do we see, first of all, if you could explain for our audience as to why has this become such an issue in present times? And is there hope in that count in the UN tax convention?
Yeah, so the issue of how to tax these big tech companies was a very key task for the OECD process to deliver on. And really why it was so contentious was that the OECD rules were developed more than 100 years ago and were really focused on physical activities. So a country could only tax a corporation if they had a permanent establishment, they call it, in a country. And the permanent establishment only came if you had physical activities. And what the tech companies, of course, changed was that no longer would you need to have that kind of physical brick and mortar kind of operation in a country. If you are Amazon or you are Facebook or you're one of the other big tech companies, you can have millions of users in a country like India without necessarily having a physical presence there. And that means that India is not allowed to tax the income that they are deriving from their users in India or any other market. And that, of course, is hugely unfair and obviously not sustainable. And that's why the OECD was asked to come up with rules. And the rules they came up with were incredibly complicated and would only result in very, very marginal changes in these tech companies' tax payments, and would only apply to extremely big corporations, very few companies, in fact. And global South countries were furious in large part with the OECD agreement because they saw that this would not work for them. And while many countries got behind the 2021 agreement that the OECD negotiated, it's also worth mentioning that we had four big countries that did not endorse the agreement. And those four countries were all from the Global South. They were Nigeria, Kenya, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And in fact, we also heard that India was also very dissatisfied, but they ended up endorsing it. But it tells you that really the countries that saw that this agreement did not work for them were countries from the Global South, while all the tax haven countries, for example, did end up endorsing the deal. And that speaks a lot, I think, to who did this agreement from 2021 really work for and who did it not work for. So there's an unresolved issue of how to tax these tech companies that the OECD agreement did not fix. And in fact, it relates back to your other question also about the US, because as I mentioned, the US has never acknowledged or implemented this part of the agreement that was meant to tax the big tech companies. So no progress has actually been made since the 2021 agreement. The contentious part about it was that the OECD agreement also forced those countries that endorsed it to remove any attempts to tax the tech companies, any unilateral measures, as they called it, such as digital service taxes that many countries had implemented. The OECD agreement said you have to roll back, you have to remove those initiatives, even though we haven't really solved the problem. And this was one of the things that many developing countries were very, very upset about. And in fact, not only Global South countries, also many European countries that had adopted digital service tax as an attempt to tax these big tech companies were forced to remove them. So there's been a lot of contentious about that. The problem has not been solved. And it's interesting to see that the UN Tax Convention, the first protocol that they will be working on, so the first specific topic that they've been asked to solve, is around cross-border services and taxation of incomes from that. And that involves, for example, the digital tech companies. So it is the top issue that this UN Tax Convention is set to deal with. And the UN process is off to a really good start. And the timeline is really that by 2027, they should come up with a proposed protocol that countries can then adopt and which becomes legally binding. And that's a really interesting possibility to break the deadlock of the OECD process, which has really come to a grinding halt. Nothing has really happened since 2021. And now we have all of a sudden again this hope and opportunity to really start taxing these tech companies. And it's so vital because we know that digital forms of companies is only expanding. They're not becoming less. They're expanding to all kinds of sectors. It's no longer just social media platforms. It's all kinds of companies. So there's an urgency to solve this problem. And thanks to the UN process, we finally have an opportunity.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you, Christian. Also, like we know that nearly 30 years of neoliberal austerity and the measures that came with it were kind of really projected right on our faces during the pandemic, which kind of showed how rickety and vulnerable we have left a large section of the global population without social security and without public spending. We hope that that this process of the UN Tax Convention and ultimately the just taxation policies, which also allows the actual user, the countries where the users are located, where the services are being consumed, they are able to tax the multinational corporations adequately. And we are able to generate the resources which is really required for spending on the people. Uh, Having said that, hypothetically, if everything goes well, and we really hope it does, and we all need to do together all that is necessary to be done, that this process reaches its logical conclusion. But would that be it? Or would the necessity of each country, even within the developing countries, say India and others, which are seeing really astounding levels of inequality, intra-country inequality within the country, uh, would steps still need to be taken at a policy level to address the difference between the top 1% and the rest that even the Oxfam report talks about?
Yeah, this is a really good question, actually, because I think it's really important to understand what the UN Tax Convention can and cannot do. The UN Tax Convention is really about international tax rules. It's not about what individual countries must do or should do. It merely seeks to update the parts of international tax rules and kind of information sharing and those kind of things. But ultimately, tax policy is set by countries. And countries is where we really need to see a lot of action also. Let me mention one example. So the UN Tax Convention also looks around taxing what they call high net wealth individuals, so the super rich, basically. The UN Tax Convention is not about setting, for example, a global wealth tax. When they speak about taxing high net wealth individuals, they're really talking about how can we share information, how can we develop standards on how to do this. But ultimately, countries will have to do this and will have to really start taxing both wealth, capital gains, and personal income of these top 1% at much higher rates than what we've been used to seeing in the past years. But the thing is, the two go together: the UN Tax Convention action at the international level and then the national level. Because what we keep hearing is that countries find it difficult to tax the super rich. They find it difficult to tax big corporations and profits. And what we've seen is that this is closely tied to globalization and to the ability of the very rich to hide their wealth in tax havens, for multinational corporations to exploit loopholes, to shift profits around the globe. So countries are finding it difficult to tax these forms of wealth and income. And that's why they've increasingly been looking at more easy to tax in their perspective income streams. So that could be, for example, through value-added taxes that tend to fall on ordinary consumers, or the salaries of government employees or other people that have a regular salary and don't have capital income, for example. And what the UN Convention can do is it can make it easier for countries to start once again to tax capital income, wealth, the really high incomes of these top 1% and the corporations. So the two go hand in hand, but the problems will not be solved alone through the UN Tax Convention. We still need to see really bold action at country level, and also not perhaps overestimate the need for global action. Global action is needed on a lot of topics, but there's also a lot that countries can do even without this global coordination. And I think you can just watch what some countries have done. For example, Colombia, who've enacted a very progressive tax reform on the rich. Bolivia, who's also implemented a net wealth tax during the pandemic because they saw the need to support ordinary citizens and for the rich to contribute more. So there is scope still for countries to do these things, even within the system we have today, but it will be so much more effective once we have a UN tax convention. And the revenue that countries can generate, for example, from a wealth tax, will go up once we have international agreements around taxing the rich. They can raise more from the global corporations if we have better international rules. So the two really go hand in hand, but we shouldn't also wait around for global coordination to happen before we start taxing the rich or start taxing corporations. We need urgent action because we can see that inequality is really getting out of hand. It's rising fast. Hunger is on the rise again. Climate crisis is demanding new unprecedented investments. So we need revenue here and now, and countries really need to act to that and look to where the money is, which is really in the hands of the top 1%.
Right. No, thank you so much, Christian. I think that is a really essential point that you underlined. I mean, of course, we saw the Latin American experiments with wealth tax, and those were the right lessons after the pandemic, where they implemented solidarity taxes of the nature that they did. Sadly, those were not the lessons that were replicated in several of the other parts of the world. But as you rightfully said, if I can summarize, is that the International Taxation Convention can create the enabling situation, but ultimate steps would need to be taken by the individual countries, and there's a lot to be done even after the convention succeeds. So I think that is all from our end at this point of time. We will keep knocking at your doors as the UN Convention proceeds, maybe for further updates. And thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much, Anirban, and thank you for the invitation, and please keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.